everyone. This is Alan Schimmel, and you're watching TechStrong TV. Today's Thursday, August 6th, and this is episode 75 of TechStrong TV. Wow, 75. That's a lot of episodes over the last couple of months. And you know, I'm going to share something with you. You know, we track, obviously, like every other business, we track the metrics of what we're doing on TechStrong TV. And, you know, when you look at it from day to day, you don't see big jumps. It's a rather steady viewership of those of you who are watching, whether it be on the web or on OTT channels on your TV, the mobile app, tablets, what have you, different venues, LinkedIn, Facebook, TechStrong TV, Digital Anarchist. But, you know, when you look at it over a course of 75 episodes, over the course of a few months, you know, there's an unmistakable trend of going up. I mean, we started this literally with zero. And yesterday's show, actually Tuesday's show, was the first day where we hit over 9,300 viewers of Tuesday's show. And that's an all-time high for us. I don't think we had broken 8,500 before. So first of all, thank you all who are watching this. Thank everyone who does watch TechStrong TV, who retweets or posts about interviews and segments we're doing. We have a lot more planned for you in the coming weeks and months. We think the show's going to continue to get better. We appreciate your patronage and your support, your sponsorship. And as always, if there's anything you'd like to see or you'd like to be on TechStrong TV, you can go on the community Slack channel at techstrongtv.slack.com or drop us a line on TechStrong TV. There's a contact and sign up there. And if you just like to be kept in the know about what's happening on TechStrong TV, you could be on the Slack channel. You could sign up for an email notifications as well. So really, again, thank you very much for all your support. You know, the other thing about today being episode 75, in my opinion, this is a kind of a flag, a stake in the ground episode for us here on TechStrong TV. I have really 3 great interviews that I'm involved in, or 3 great segments I'm involved with, that I've been looking forward to for some time. And then, of course, we have Charlene and Mitchell. Charlene has, I believe, 2 interviews today. So it's going to be a great show. We also have a great Something Old with my friend Derek Weeks, and from Sonatype, one of the co-founders of All Day DevOps, and they've just announced that, and registration is open. So let me share with you what we have on store today. Our first interview, you know, continues a series we've been doing with my friend Elizabeth Zalman, CEO of Strong DM. Today, Elizabeth and I talk with Dave Anderson of mParticle. And mParticle is just, you know, another one of these new companies based in New York, but kind of distributed. And you know, they are cloud native companies, I call them, right? They're doing things, made it really easy for them to be remote. They use a lot of cloud stuff. They're what I call high performing IT organization companies. And Dave's going to talk to us about mParticle and how they work there, and a little bit, of course, about what they do with Strong DM. And Elizabeth will chime in as well. It's a great interview. Check that out. Then I'm really happy to have my friend Brad Feld on. Most of you don't know this, but I sold my first company to Brad in the late 90s, then went to work with him at a company called Interliant that was an early ASP, and kind of cloud before there was cloud, virtual before there was virtual. And anyway, of course, Brad's went on to much bigger and better things. He's founder of partner in the Foundry Group. He was at Mobius Venture Capital. He's also one of the co-founders of Techstars. And Brad kind of has become synonymous with the term startup community. In fact, that's the book he wrote. I think it was, I want to say back in 2012. He wrote a book called Startup Community, and it became sort of the how-to guide for forging a startup community in cities across the world. And it was based on something called the Boulder thesis, a couple of lessons and kind of hypotheses that Brad extrapolated from the groundbreaking work he did in helping to create Boulder into the tech center that it was. Well, he's refreshed that and come out with a sequel now along with a co-author, and that book is called The Startup Community Way, and it looks at the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem, and that includes beyond the entrepreneur, the instigators, the support, government, universities, all the different components that make up this startup community, this entrepreneurial ecosystem. They're different. And it also talks about the relationship between the entrepreneur and all of these other players, important players in the mix. So I had a chance to really sit down with Brad and go over this. I haven't really interviewed Brad in some time, so it was great to catch up. I hope you'll enjoy that interview. And that should be on approximately 23, 24 minutes from now, if you want to come back to that. Then after Brad, what a day we have. So I've been working on this now for 2 or 3 months, and it's the start of a new series that we're going to be doing here on TechStrong TV, and it's called DevOps Unbound. We're going to do it bi-weekly, and every other week we're going to have a panel of anywhere, including myself, anywhere from 3 to 6 people. And we're going to spend about 40 minutes jumping into a subject around DevOps. We'll talk about acceleration. We're going to talk about automation. We're going to talk about different schools of thought around DevOps and how DevOps is influencing organizations, beyond IT even, and so forth like that. DevOps Unbound is sponsored by our friends at Tricentis, and I thank them very much for their sponsorship. And in this episode, inaugural episode, we're going to take a brief history. We're going to take a look at the brief history of testing, and how it plays into what DevOps is today, and the role of the developer and the tester and security, and how this all plays out. It is 40 minutes, so it'll be on. Brad's interview's about a half hour, so maybe an hour from now, DevOps Unbound will be on it. It'll also be a standalone on digitalanarchist.com, so I highly, highly recommend it. If you can't catch it on TechStrong TV, catch just DevOps Unbound on Digital Anarchist. The audio will also be broken out as a sound, audio-only podcast. But do check out DevOps Unbound. I think you're really going to like it. And then once a month, we're actually going to do a roundtable open to the public on DevOps Unbound, where we'll have 6 to 8 people on the roundtable doing a deep dive on a particular area of DevOps. And we welcome folks to come on, ask questions, get involved. It's a new thing we're doing here at TechStrong TV, and I think you're really going to like it. After that, we're going to do something old, and from TechStrong Con back in early June, I'm really happy to have Derek Weeks from Sonatype and co-founder of All Day DevOps. DevOps presented, Derek Weeks presented about a model on machine learning based upon a ton of research him and others have done over the years to identify best open source project behaviors, what behaviors work, etc. It's a really great presentation from Derek. I'll also mention that Derek and Mark Miller over at Sonatype have just opened up All Day DevOps registration. I want to say it's in November, but you can check that out at All Day DevOps. And Derek does a good job in this presentation. I think you'll like it. After Derek, I'll be back, of course, with the news around the MediaOps neighborhood, and then we'll turn things over to Charlene. Charlene O'Hanlon, our managing editor, has 2 videos today, 2 interviews. One is Colin Turin of Quest Software. She'll also be doing a webinar preview for webinars coming up next week, early in the week. And then Charlene also has Russ Moore from Mobile Iron, and that should be a good interview. And then after that, we're going to turn things over to Mitch at the Analyst Corner. Mitchell has, as usual, great commentary and guest. and then I'll be back to wrap things up. We're probably a good 3 hours strong today, TechStrong, and but it's one of our best shows. You don't want to miss it. However, if you do miss any of the segments, they are all available on TechStrong TV, usually a day or so after. They're all available on digitalanarchist.com, a day or so after the stream of this show finishes. So, with that said, let's take a break, and we're going to be right back with Liz Zalman and Dave Anderson of Strong DM and mParticle. You know, I've been doing a series of interviews that I had the pleasure of doing with my friend Elizabeth Zalman, CEO of Strong DM, and some of Strong DM's customers who are willing to come in and talk about their business and how they're working and how IT is functioning during COVID and everything else. In this segment of that, we were joined by Dave Anderson of mParticle. And if you're not familiar with mParticle, check out this interview. I think you're going to enjoy it. They're one of these, I see a pattern in the companies that, you know, Strong DM and Liz work with. They're what I call high-performing IT teams who are very, you know, digitally transformed, very distributed. Working remote was not a problem for them. They've hardly hiccuped during COVID and everything else. And a large part of that is they use Strong DM to help them with, as a proxy to assets in the cloud and IAM, etc. Great interview here with Liz Zalman and Dave Anderson. Let's take a listen now.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey everyone, back here for another segment on TechStrong TV. I am joined once again by my friend Liz Zalman at Strong DM. Hey Liz, how are you?
Hi, Alan. I'm well, thank you.
Good to have you back on. And joining Liz and I today, another guest, is Dave Anderson. Dave is the CISO at mParticle. Hey, Dave, welcome to TechStrong TV.
How's it going?
Going great. Not as great as you are. Dave's coming at us from a sailboat today, and we're all stuck in our homes and offices, but hey, the life of a CISO, and you guys complain. Anyway, you know what, I don't know. It's hard to make that less glamorous, Dave, but we'll give you the pass. Liz, for those who, you know, haven't seen some of our previous interviews with you and the Strong DM team and some of the customers, why don't we start off, give our audience a quick background, who's Strong DM, what you guys do?
Strong is a proxy, and it lets people manage and audit access to any firewalled infrastructure, servers, databases, Kubernetes clusters, RDP, firewalled web apps, HTTP endpoints. So essentially, instead of managing keys and creds, you give people access to Strong, and then it talks to the target systems on your behalf. So you get access control and then auditing through the proxy itself.
Everything you expect from your proxy. Great. and it's sort of proxy as a service, if you will, yeah?
Yeah, there's a portion of it that is hosted, the control plane itself, and then the rest goes through your own hardware.
Got it.
Or
Dave?
Whatever your virtual hardware is these days.
Well, yeah, no one uses hardware. Through your own infrastructure. How's that? Dave, talk to us about mParticle.
Yeah, so mParticle is a customer data platform. So what that means is our customers are able to use our platform to ingest pretty much anything, any data about their customers, about the activity that's going on their websites and mobile apps, into the mParticle platform, and then we're able to give our customers the full control of being able to fan that out to like any of our different integration partners. So there's all that, as well as being able to do things like data quality, match identity resolution, figure out like where a particular user is, what sort of ways you want, how they're interacting with their particular application or whatnot. I mean, to be honest, we have customers like in a bunch of different verticals, and they all use the product a little differently. And it's we're continuing to grow and innovate and figure out different ways of kind of helping our customers along with their data journey.
Excellent. And that kind of mission is just so attuned with what I think companies are looking for today, right? Which is, there's so much data out there. There's so much, do you want it all? What are you going to do with it all? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? But the idea of being able to access that, analyze it, hopefully with as much automation as possible, is what it's all about. Of course, it also creates, as a CISO, this, it creates tremendous responsibilities and potential pitfalls from a security, data, access, compliance point of view. But it also, to the strong DM mission of proxying through firewall to assets, whether those assets are remote workers who have to access, data in the cloud or on-prem or wherever, or just whether they're remote or not, accessing corporate assets, which in your case are, in some cases, I'm going to assume, a lot of PII kind of data.
Exactly.
This is a potential security nightmare. This is what keeps CISOs up at night on their boats. So, talk to us, Dave. How does strong DM help you sleep better?
So naturally, we're a data collection and distribution company. So we have a lot of data split up into a lot of different databases, and we have to have very tight access controls for those databases. So one of the things that Strong DM gives us the capability of doing for when any sort of like support people or operations people need access to a particular database or data set within the kind of in-particle backend, we're able to utilize Strong DM to give us the ability to have secure access to that that is able to be tied back to the individual who's doing the work. Everything is audited, everything's logged. We're able to generate reports for compliance. So it gives us the capabilities of not having to give our like a support person, for example, give them a direct access to the database. They have like a nice tool they can use. Everything's integrated nicely on the desktop. Everything is integrated well with all of our identity management platforms as well.
Excellent. So, Dave, I think we get what we're doing there. We get what the potential risk is, and we've done a few in full disclosure. We've done a few interviews with some of the strong DM clients in fintech and other verticals. What we haven't done is like kind of peeled back. Using a proxy, I think a lot of our audience has probably used a proxy one way or another. But I want to peel back now in the case of mParticle. Walk us through how you guys sort of said, okay, we're going to use Strong DM. How'd you set it up? How did you deploy? How do you manage it? Right? How does it give you the warm, fuzzy feeling you need to know that you can sleep well at night?
Well, to be perfectly transparent, I'm pretty new at mParticle. So
you inherited it.
Yeah, so I inherited it. But I actually am a pretty early Strong DM customer from my last job at Greenhouse Software.
Okay.
so I'm very familiar with that aspect of it. We had used it for similar purposes back then. Back at Greenhouse, we had a lot of support personnel that were and kind of data quality engineers that were using the Strong DM platform to access our databases within AWS, and it's similar here. We want to have we try to keep as much the access as restricted as possible. We believe in the principle of least privilege and
Sure.
separation of duties. So with that, we need to have our networks like deeply isolated. The databases like live kind of deep into the network, not even having access to the outside world. And with that, the only way to give somebody in support the access to that database traditionally would have been giving them VPN into that environment, and then have them having to actually install like the different tools, and having to manage authentication and access control. And even then, what would happen is we would also lose visibility into what they did on that database, like what queries did they run, what data did they see, because it's not even necessarily a kind of everyday type of thing that for someone to have access to the data itself. We tightly control who has access to what data, and using a tool like StrongDM is pretty much a requirement for that.
Yeah. I mean, and look, and I'll try to put it in layman's terms for our audience who maybe aren't as familiar with this stuff. When you're using a VPN, they call it a tunnel, right? A tunneling tool. Because really what you're doing is you're punching a tunnel through, whether it's your firewall and your infrastructure, and it's an encrypted tunnel at that, right? So everything that takes place within that tunnel is encrypted. And so when I connect to a database via a VPN, you may see that I did connect. Oh yeah, that's Alan's client. He connected to the database. But in terms of what data was in that tunnel and what, you really don't have visibility there by its very definition. Right, on purpose. It's not a byproduct. That's how it's supposed to be, and you don't, you can. It's just that's how it was designed, and so that doesn't really play well, in the areas of DLP, and you want to make sure data's not exfoliated, taken out. It's a problem. So now StrongDM helps you solve that's what you're telling me, because now we can see, it's a proxy, but on the backside of the proxy that goes into the firewall and into the trusted network, as we used to call it 100 years ago when I was in security, right? When you go through that into the trusted network, you could still see where Liz went or Alan went or Dave went, because it's not that tunneled, right? It's not that encrypted tunnel through there. It's more of the proxy. I remember when we were natting firewalls, right? A long time ago, and it was that same thing. At least I could match up this IP to that IP, the behind the firewall versus the public IP, private IP, public IP, and so you had some of that then. Then on top of it, look, giving people a VPN with everything going on in COVID and remote workers and all we're hitting, and of course, they're not just hitting your database. There's also SaaS apps that they need to hit and everything. A VPN I'm not a big fan of VPNs in today's world, if you can't tell, okay? It don't make sense. I mean, and the whole idea of VPNing back into a central kind of office to go back out to the cloud, also kind of, a friend of mine, I know a guy named Jay Chowdhury, who's, of course, the CEO founder of Zscaler. He used to rail from the very time the cloud first started coming on scene big, 2006, 7. He was saying back then that VPNs were, a time has come. But here we are, 2020, same thing. But Dave, how easy was it to set up the StrongDM proxy, and what kind of visibility is it giving you?
Yeah, I mean, setting up strong DM is really easy. It's a couple pieces of infrastructure that you put into your environment, and that would all depend on how you deploy your infrastructure. Um, the So there's, I'm trying to remember the exact terminology, like a gateway and a, what was that?
Liz, can you help him here?
Yeah.
What?
Can you help him out here?
I said it. I said gateway.
Well,
I would
Yeah.
we got you here
my
just to
friend
see the
hanging. Never.
Yeah, so you deploy that infrastructure. That basically it's that sits in your network, and you have and then it talks back to the Strong DM portal, and so the Strong DM clients actually know who to talk to, like what IP addresses and what databases it has access to. You go through the Strong DM UI, or you can use their API, depending on your preference, to set up different databases and set up the credentials in there and all the users and what users have access to what databases and what roles within those databases they have access to. And then there's a client that runs on the person's laptop. And that client, like you're talking connect locally to that client. It's magically on the Strong DM backend, like routing everything around to the right place, and makes it extremely streamlined for the end user, because they just have this little control panel down there, like in the bottom of their screen, that lets them connect to the particular database, and it's really ridiculously easy to use.
Very cool. Now, as part of the role in CISO, you always got to be thinking, not if, but when we have an incident, right? I've got to be able to do forensics. I've got to have an audit trail, right? I've got to be able to figure out what the heck. And I have to show people what happened here. Did we take reasonable steps, right? And stuff like that. What is it in terms of audit trail and forensics? How does Strong DM help you there?
So it shows us who connected to what resource, when, how long they were connected, what they did, what sort of queries they ran, what sort of other kind of SQL commands or whatever the database may be, and be able to produce that in near real time, as well as have logs to go back to if there was an incident, that we would know what that data was accessed by a particular individual.
And that's kind of the control plane that sits in the cloud, Liz, or that's local to the client?
The auditing happens through the gateway. So when the request hits the gateway, it actually deconstructs it in order to provide the audit trail. So that stays resident in Dave's network.
Excellent. So yeah, we don't have to worry about access to strangers to that.
Yeah, no, it's his data. We don't want to touch it.
Yeah, that's one of the most attractive things, actually, was the fact that the data stays in our network. Strong DM operates the how things actually get connected, but as far as once you're in that network, everything stays within there.
Cool. All right, sounds great. Dave, one other question. With COVID and everybody working remote, I know, look, I mean, Strong DM, from what I've seen, is built not built, but they while there are plenty of people obviously suffering as a result of COVID, and my heart goes out, I'm sure as you guys too, to people who have lost loved ones and are sick and have lost jobs and money and, all of the bad things that are happening with this. The fact is, with remote workers being more and more common, solutions like a Strong DM are thriving, right? Are being rapidly adopted, and not because they're nice to have, because you got to have something like that, right? So I'm wondering, what are you guys seeing at mParticle, and similar kind of thing as you're going remote?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, we were really well equipped for going remote. A lot of the engineering team is distributed to begin with. We had people in Seattle, Florida, Texas, and New York, of course. But we were able to transition to it pretty seamlessly. We just spent a lot more time on Zoom.
Don't we all?
Yeah. Yes, but having the technology in place for being able to securely connect to remote networks, remote resources, is definitely it's a requirement nowadays. I mean, especially with you don't have a perimeter anymore. There is that network, the whole concept of having that network firewall that was sitting there and protecting everything is kind of dead now, especially with ever since everybody's working from home. I mean, and VPNs, as we were talking about before, only give you so much. There's only so much flexibility you have with how you can protect your network and segment your network to make a VPN be as flexible as a platform like StrongDM.
Look, I thought network firewalls were dead in 2007. Right, and I remember the first time I saw a Jericho. I don't know if you remember this, Dave, but do you remember the Jericho project? Did you ever hear of that? They were the first ones to talk about the deperimeterization of security and micro perimeters and personal perimeter and all that stuff. And that whole moat and castle setup that the network firewall played in, and the VPN was a sort of a bastardized child of. That disappeared when we got mobile devices and people started going mobile. Sounds like a Who song, going mobile. Anyway, but yeah, I don't disagree with you. Liz, let me ask you, I mean, mParticle, is this sort of it seems like it's right in the sweet spot for what you guys are doing then, right? This is the mission.
This is the mission, yeah, and it's and actually Dave shifting from, I mean, what do you call Greenhouse? ATS? It's a form of data management, actually. Mm-hmm. Shifting into customer data it's a vertical that I hold dear because I actually started my career in ad tech, and what he's describing is what I wanted a decade ago. So like, I personally love the fact that mParticle is a customer. There is simply no place to store that stuff, and then to link it across various touch points. It never came to fruition. But yeah, a company that is distributed, that is in hyper growth, it has large corporate clients who have, I'm guessing, Dave, tell me if I'm wrong, contractual requirements with respect to security and pen testing and various attestations. Of
course.
Yeah. Yeah. We do a good business in that area, and it hits all those things.
Very cool. Guys, we're about out of time. Dave, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day on the boat. Yeah. To join us here. All kidding aside, man, it actually is a very great socially distanced
way to get work done.
Truth be told, I was supposed to be on a boat tomorrow, and I canceled because I had some stuff come up.
But it's
Alan,
tough.
It's not that StrongDM helps Dave sleep better at night. It's those waves and the harbor too.
Yeah, well, they'll help you sleep either way. That'll help you sleep well as well. I'm not going to go there though, Liz.
It's also my alarm clock in the morning.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
You know what? All right, the guy's on a boat. Yeah, there's worse things. It doesn't make him a spoiled person. And I don't want to give, you know what? But for all those people who say CISOs are underworked and overpaid, as Dave's living here on the boat, that's not true. CISOs are overworked and underpaid. But anyway, Liz, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Alan.
Right, we'll hopefully have another interview with you soon, maybe.
I think we have one on Friday.
Very cool. Dave, thank you for joining us. Great continued success with mParticle. Sounds like a great business and a great use case here for StrongDM. And enjoy your time. Stay safe and stay well.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Hey, this is Alan Schimmel. You just watched another TechStrong TV segment. We're going to be right back with another guest.
ContainerJournal.com is the leading online destination for centralized computing-related content. ContainerJournal.com covers all aspects of software containers, from container management, data management for containers, container security, networking for containers, to the entire container ecosystem, Kubernetes, microservices, serverless, and more. ContainerJournal.com has the largest selection of container-related news, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.containerjournal.com to learn more. ContainerJournal.com is operated by MediaOps Inc., the team behind DevOps.com, Digital Anarchist, SecurityBoulevard.com, DevOps Connect, and DevOpsDozen.com.
Our next segment features, as I said at the top of the show, my friend Brad Feld around his new book, The Startup Community Way. Brad is someone who really needs no introduction in the tech world. He's been an entrepreneur, investor in literally dozens and hundreds of companies over the years. He's had a lot of successes, but don't be fooled. It's like the gambler who says he always wins, right? Anyone who tells you about just their success is lying, right? They've had a lot of failures and a lot of hard lessons. And Brad will be the first to tell you he's learned a lot of lessons the hard way. Not everything works out the way you want it, but you make the best of it. And Brad's living proof. I mean, at the end of the day, more importantly, is he learns from everything he does. And he's taken that learning and he shared it with people. He shared it in a series of books he's done around startup communities, which is kind of his thing. I remember in 1997, Brad trying to get me to move to Boulder, Colorado, because he was building this ecosystem that, he didn't call it a startup community then, but that's what he was building. And he was one of the lead folks in it, and Boulder is today what Boulder, Colorado is today. But he's also been responsible as a co-founder of Techstars for seeding startup communities around the world. And this new book represents kind of his latest thinking and refinement of kind of the theories that he's been building in the startup community series. And this is the latest and greatest. I had a great conversation with him. I think you're going to enjoy it. Here now is Brad Feld on the Startup Community Way.
This is Digital Anarchist.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on this segment for TechStrong TV. I am thrilled beyond thrilled to be joined by an old friend of mine. Not that he's old, but we know each other a very, very long time. My friend Brad Feld, who really needs no introduction in any kind of tech kind of discussion. Hey Brad, welcome.
Alan, it's great to be here. Awesome to see you.
It's awesome to see you, my friend. I haven't seen you in too long. And I don't know when I'm going to see you in person again with the current state of affairs, but I hope it's soon.
Well, I get virtual Alan and you get virtual Brad.
That's the best that we're going to have to do. So, Brad, we have you on here today because your book came out, I guess it was last week it came out officially, right? And it's called The Startup Community Way. It is a sequel or follow-on to kind of to the Startup Community book that you originally authored. How long ago? That had to be, 7 years ago? Was the first book?
Yeah, Startup Communities came out in 2012. And along with the publication of the Startup Community Way, we came out with a second edition of Startup Communities that has some updates to it and some things that I got wrong the first time around fixed. We're going
to talk about those. Yep. And we should mention, Brad, that you have a co-author in this Startup Community Way book, and that's Ian Hathaway. And Ian maybe less entrepreneurial or less experienced in the VC entrepreneur world, but very experienced in research and kind of doing, looking at this scientifically, if you will.
Yeah, he was a really good co-author. He's become a close friend. And part of the thing that was good about it was we do have different frames of reference. So as we talk through and work through the book and work through different ideas around the book, pressing against each other from different frames of reference really generated, I think, much better ideas and much better writing.
Excellent. So, Brad, I'm going to make some assumptions here. First of all, our audience is a very geeky, techie audience, right? We cater to digital transformation, DevOps, cloud native, open source kind of stuff, and of course, cyber. They know who Brad Feld is. They're familiar with Techstars. They're familiar with startups. They're probably even familiar with the term startup community, which you kind of initially coined with the book, right? So I don't want to spend all of our time sort of laying that foundation. They're familiar who Brad Feld is as well. And if you're not, I'm going to tell you really quick. I sold my first company to Brad in 1997. He'll tell you I was wearing a stupid sports jacket, but we're not even going to talk about it. He's been at SoftBank Venture Capital, Mobius, Foundry Group, started TechStars, one of the kind of forces behind NIT. How do you pronounce it? National Nitwit is. What does it sound? What does it stand for, Brad?
NCWIT, National Center for Women in Information Technology.
Yep, and it's one of my favorite things you've done. But I mean, beyond, we could go on and on, but let's not. Brad, I started reading Startup Community Way, and I have some issues, questions, areas I want to jump in on with you, if it's okay.
Let's do it.
So, obviously, with the initial startup community, you had this, what they call what you coined the Boulder thesis. And there were 4 main points in the Boulder thesis. Number one, though, and sort of primal to me, was that for startup communities to thrive, they need to be led by entrepreneurs, right? These entrepreneurs had to have a long-range kind of commitment to the community. And let's stop right there for a second. I noticed in the new book, you kind of made a realization that in forming that, we set the entrepreneurs up as sort of the alpha predators, as the top dogs on the food chain, right? But in doing so, it might have created a little bit of us versus them between entrepreneurs and the other, I'm not going to say equal participants, but vital participants in this equation of a startup community. The workers of these companies who go to work at entrepreneurs, universities, government agencies, the community, right? It's not just entrepreneurs. And I think one of the things you're seeking to address in the book is to kind of ease that tension, but the us versus them tension, correct?
Yeah, that was a mistake I made in the first book, and it was a mistake of language, not of intent or description. So in the first book, I made the strong assertion that the leaders of a startup community have to be entrepreneurs, and in the absence of a critical mass of entrepreneurs playing leadership roles, your startup community won't grow and evolve. I then labeled everyone else a feeder, and my intention was not to have leaders be one up on feeders, one up, one down relationship, but just different. And I tried to categorize them differently and spent a fair amount of time in the book describing what leaders do and what feeders do. And the miss was there's a lot of people who play leadership roles in startup communities who are not entrepreneurs. And in the new book, and I also went back and updated the second edition of the old book, I now call them instigators. And the idea of an instigator is that they are playing a leadership role in the startup community. And that's a very powerful notion. So essentially, people now are classified as leaders and instigators, and the organizations are feeders. And that's really important because the organizations tend to be hierarchical. They tend to have their own agenda in addition to the agenda of the startup community. And the fundamental goal of a startup community, pure and simple, is to help entrepreneurs succeed. And the feeder organizations, part of their goal as organizations are to help entrepreneurs succeed, but that's not their only goal. We also distinguish now between the notion of a startup community and an entrepreneurial ecosystem. A startup community at its core exists to help entrepreneurs succeed. An entrepreneurial ecosystem has at its core a startup community, but it's a much bigger thing, and engage all of these other organizations around their goals and how they engage with entrepreneurship. So I think we've done a better job in the startup community way of talking about leadership and who provides leadership, and the people providing the leadership in the startup community being both the leaders, the entrepreneurs, and the instigators, people who aren't entrepreneurs, but but who are playing a leadership role. And then the organizations, the other actors who contribute to the startup community, but don't control it, don't try to organize it, don't try to run it, just participate in it.
Excellent. You know, Brad, there's a lot of analogies there to what we see in the DevOps world, right? The developers have become the entrepreneurs of the first startup community, of first edition of startup community, where it seems the rest of the DevOps ecosystem revolves around these developers. And look, developers are impossible to hire. They're, as you know from your companies, they demand a lot of money. They want a lot of say over their environments, their culture, and everything else. They're kind of calling the shots, and the rest of the world kind of revolves around it. But also a lot more is thrown on these developers' shoulders in terms of what they're no longer responsible just for code. They're responsible for deployment. They're responsible to make sure the testing is right. You know, for that whole software factory, they in essence run the factory. And it's similar kind of thing has happened in DevOps, where we've said, hold on, yes, the developer's role is a very important role, but so is that of the cyber person, so is that of the SRE, so is that of the tester, and literally it does take a community, and it's caused a bit of a realignment, if you will, within how we look at DevOps and cloud native and continuous deployment. I wonder, carrying that analogy out, Brad, though, I think a lot of our audience out here, they tend to interchange entrepreneur with technical entrepreneur. And I wanted to talk to you about the role of the business entrepreneur, my own selfish reasons. But, and you have a ton of experience on this. When we talk about entrepreneurs, Brad, how much of it is, so a technical entrepreneur, the kind of person who goes on to be the CTO in their startup or in their company, versus people who come from the business side of things, right? And what's the right mix, or I don't know if there is a right mix, but what's the right formula for when we look at entrepreneurs within the greater entrepreneurial ecosystem, within the startup community, between technical entrepreneurs and let's call them business-orientated entrepreneurs? Make sense?
Well, they're both it makes total sense. They're both essential. And when I talk about entrepreneur, I don't really distinguish between the two. I think there are many different roles that founders or entrepreneurs play. And for a lot of people, the word entrepreneur tends to be triggering. Like it used to be something that was very well understood. Today, the word entrepreneur gets used, I would say, almost indiscriminately in a lot of different contexts. And to your question, I would come back to the notion specifically of a founder of a company, somebody who is one of the people that helps create the company from the very beginning. And you need a combination. You need technical founders, technical entrepreneurs. You need business founders, business entrepreneurs. Most companies generally have more than one co-founder. There are definitely successful companies with one founder, but generally speaking, if you have more than one founder, especially if you have a combination of a business founder and a technical founder, you can make a lot more progress a lot quicker in many cases. And if you have 3 or 4 founders, I generally try to encourage people to have at least an equal number of technical founders to non-technical founders, and preferably more technical founders than non-technical founders. And Alan, you're humble. I mean, you talk about yourself as the business guy, but you have very, very deep technical experience at this point. Even when I met you when you were running your first company in the late 1990s, you had deep technical experience. So that technical founder doesn't necessarily mean just somebody who writes code. And I like to shift the language to be product-oriented instead of technical. So if you think about 3 co-founders, the idea that 2 of them are focused on product and 1 of them is focused on the business. And the product and the business obviously overlap at the customer. And so all 3 of the founders are paying attention to the customer. the evolution of what you're trying to do from the very beginning can move a lot quicker. By the way, there are a lot of very, very good technical founders who also have strong business sense, in the same way that you're a strong business person that also has strong technical sense. So it's not cut and dry, and you're not like, oh, I'm in this box and you're in this box. I try to encourage entrepreneurs to think more broadly about what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Excellent. Hey, I'd like to shift a little bit away from the entrepreneur because they get all the press. I want to talk about something that was really highlighted in your book, and that is the role of, within the community and within the ecosystem, the role of universities and the role of government, the role of these hierarchical groups, as you referred to them. Let's talk a little, and I'm going to bring it home to what I see here in South Florida, for instance. But Brad, it's an important role they play in this big picture. But what can the government do optimally, for instance, to help here? There's federal, there's state, there's local. Where do you see it?
You have to be somewhat granular, and you also have to be focused on the specific place that you're at, whether it is local, state, or federal or national governments. Interestingly, in the first book in 2012, I basically punted on this issue. I said the best government can do is do no harm to the startup community. And, I would say that was a combination of me not really having a particularly clear view of what government could have, along with me kind of punting and being lazy about digging into it, based on my own experience. My own experience in Boulder, for example, is that the local government basically pays no attention to entrepreneurship and doesn't really understand how to engage it in an effective way. State of Colorado government actually has done a pretty good job. And there have been a number of things over the years that the state of Colorado has done around this. And then, our federal government in the U.S. ebbs and flows. Sometimes there are some programs that are incredibly helpful, and oftentimes there are things that either get in the way or are counterproductive. So I've come to a place where what I think is important for government at any level to start with is to understand what their goal is. And I'm going to come back to this statement I said earlier, which is the goal of a startup community is to help entrepreneurs succeed. So if government wants to engage in the startup community, their goal should be to help entrepreneurs succeed. Now, at a local level, that often means that the best way to do it is to have an instigator, I'm going to use that word again, who is a person who works for local government, who actively engages as a leader in the startup community. So they're not actually bringing government so much to the startup community, but they're in their role in government, they may have a full-time job to help with economic development or developing the entrepreneurial ecosystem or whatever it is. Like, their first step should be to become part of the startup community as an instigator, rather than show up as government and say, hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Mm-hmm. One of the things that government really struggles with is allocating capital. Government has a lot of capital, as we've just learned from the COVID crisis. Overnight, the federal government allocated or deployed $2 trillion, and looks like it's going to allocate another $1 trillion across our society. And a lot of that money went towards helping, quote, small business, where government thinks of small business and entrepreneurial businesses as the same. If you use that lens, though, and you look at how that money was allocated, it was primarily allocated through two vehicles, PPP loans and idle loans, that it was incredibly inefficiently allocated. And as a result, some companies got financial support, others didn't. And it was done in this very, very sort of explosive way that may have had some very powerful short-term impacts, but it's unclear on whether it has medium or longer term impacts. One last sort of comment on government. State governments over and over again, we need more venture capital here. We need more capital here, and we need to do things to get more capital here. In the startup community way, we actually defined capital as having 7 different flavors, where financial capital was one. Because generally when people talk about capital, they're talking about money. And this is another place where governments can really help, is to think about what capital the startup community already has that's not financial capital. What kind of intellectual capital, what kind of network capital, what kind of infrastructure capital exists, and what more is needed. And then try to figure out how to use the resources of local or state government to amplify those types of capital that ultimately then is a positive reinforcing loop to attract other sources of capital. So unfortunately, I think for government, it's nuanced. And a lot of times government is looking for a playbook and a solution. Like, I just need to do the following 4 things and then good things will happen. And this is essential to the startup community way, where we talk about startup communities now as complex systems. Yeah. And one of the things that many organizations have a lot of trouble interacting with, especially government, but not exclusively government, is complex systems.
So let me talk a little bit about complex systems here in South Florida. I know you've been down in Miami a few times. You've had a chance to see sort of the Miami startup scene. And you know what? In 4 or 5 short years, it's actually come a long way. You know, it's the gateway to Latin America, and they talk about all that. But more importantly, there are some really concrete programs. The Knight Foundation, a few other organizations, as well as local government, has instituted it. And we're beginning to see a startup community take hold there, in my opinion. It's not Boulder, it's not Austin, but it doesn't have to be. It's Miami anyway. But South Florida is more than Miami, right? You basically have a tri-county or 3-city sort of metro area of Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach. Taken together, I forget if it's the 6th or 7th largest metropolitan area in the U.S., right? Between these 3 counties, Miami-Dade, Fort Broward, and Palm Beach County. Tremendous amount of universities. We haven't even talked about universities yet, but we have University of Miami and FIU and FAU here. Lots of universities that are, you know, in your first book when you talked about the role, you know, they do serve as anchors. I think what holds us back in the South Florida area, though, Brad, is that we have Shoguns, right? I remember when your business card used to say Shogun. Remember those days? But we have Shoguns here. Every 10 or 15 miles, each little town or incorporated village is afraid that the next one is going to do more better than them. Here in my little neck of the woods, Boca Raton and Delray Beach, they're right next to each other, constantly banging heads. Boca has the universities, maybe a little more capital. Delray has a great sort of startup scene brewing, and they do have local economic development and a number of co-working places and stuff like that. But they can't seem to get their act together to work. And these are just 2 little piddling towns, to tell you the truth, right? If they would put it together, they might have something. But they can't. They're too busy competing. And it's the same thing up and down this coast. Right? So you have an area with a lot of schools, a lot of universities, a lot of capital, a decent amount of tech talent. I mean, not deep enough by any means, and certainly many entrepreneurs. But they're at loggerheads. How do you, in creating this entrepreneurial ecosystem, how do you overcome this sort of petty jealousy, these shoguns fighting for supremacy?
Well, you have to start from a perspective of playing a positive sum game. And what you're describing is a classic zero-sum game where there's winners or losers.
Yep.
And, you know, the ones that we're used to in terms of zero-sum game in election is a zero-sum game. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Sports events, most of them, zero-sum game, winner, loser. Sometimes you tie if you play, you know, soccer, but you know, for most games, there's a definitive winner or loser. You don't want to play a zero-sum game. You want to play the opposite of that, which is a positive-sum game, where the cliche would be rising tide lifts all boats, right? You're helping each other over time, sort of building something that's more and more successful. And in defining startup community, you can define startup community however you want in terms of geography. You can define it in, you know, a little town like Boca or Delray. You can draw a bigger circle around it and call it the greater Miami metro area or whatever you want to call it. By the way, you said something earlier that's really important, is that you don't need to create or emulate somebody else. Boulder is Boulder. Miami is Miami. Greater Miami is Greater Miami. Boca is Boca. Like, you already have an identity as a city. But the key is to try to work with the people who are close to you to build a broader and more robust startup community. And interestingly, if you're taking this approach of playing a positive sum game where you help each other versus you compete for resources and you compete to win or lose in sort of an inappropriate way, or an unhelpful way, it doesn't really matter. The very specific example I'd give you is that, does it cost anything to travel from Delray to Boca? You have to pay. You have to pay. You can walk, right? You don't have to pay. You don't have to pay a tax. You don't have to have somebody stamp your passport to get from one place to another. I mean, you really are not yet. You're part of a collaborative collection of people. And the goal should be that you want to encourage cross-fertilization between those communities, and you want to encourage amplification of what's going on and get critical mass around it. Now, there's nothing wrong with local pride. And I can use Boulder and Denver as really good examples of that. Boulder and Denver are both very, very, very vibrant cities. Boulder's 100,000 people. Denver's 2 million people. They're about a 30 to 45-minute drive apart from each other. They have independent identities, but there's an enormous amount of collaboration between the two, and that's very, very, very powerful.
I mean, I've done meetup groups in Denver and Boulder. We started one with the Jump Cloud folks called IT is Code. First meeting was down in Lodell. But we had people from all over, from Boulder and everywhere else, drive in, and we had a great meeting at one of the breweries there. Good times. I've started a bunch of meetup groups here in South Florida, and we're constantly, we have to do this one in Miami for the Miami people. We need to be down near Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood this time, or out at the university out west there to attract that Broward crowd. There isn't that sense of community that the rising tide lifts all boats, and I'm hoping that books like The Startup Community Way kind of make their way into the stream here, the mainstream of what these people are thinking about. We even see it, Brad, with so we have the South Florida Technology Association. Then we have the Palm Beach Technology Association. There's several counterparts in Miami. They even compete at and it's a petty competition, frankly.
Well, they could really change the game in the region by deciding to collaborate. And they can have separate organizations with separate memberships and separate goals, even if they're in the same place, because there's no need for there to be one monolithic thing. In fact, you probably want a bunch of different things. But instead of viewing it as I win, you lose, they're all trying to help entrepreneurs succeed. And in the context of that, again, the instigators, the leaders of those organizations, right? Those organizations, even if they're comprised of entrepreneurs, are still feeder organizations, right? The organization themselves is a feeder supporting entrepreneurs. The people in those organizations who are playing leadership roles can play a leadership role in the startup community, which is separate from their organization. Their organization is not the thing that's organizing, managing, running the startup community. It's just another participant in this. And so changing that frame of reference for humans is hard because we're used to competing. No,
it's like the Highlander. There could be only one, right? And it's a problem. I get it.
Well, and changing that is important. And it's one thing to say it's important to change. It's another thing for a bunch of leaders in a startup community to say, you know what, enough of this. We don't need the segmentation. We don't need the competition. Let's all pull together, even though we're addressing different things and we have some overlap. We're trying to do something together that makes our place better.
Fantastic. Brad, we're almost out of time. I wanted to leave you a couple minutes at the end here for our audience watching. If you had the three biggest takeaways from the book that you want people to, go home with, what would you say they are?
The first is the distinction between a startup community and an entrepreneurial ecosystem, and the reinforcement that the goal of the startup community is to help entrepreneurs succeed. And you can define everything from there. The second is that a startup community is a complex system. And in a complex system, there is no deterministic outcome. There is no playbook. There is no set of rules to get from point A to point B. A simple system would be making a cup of coffee. You put beans into the machine, you get coffee out. Might not be a good cup of coffee, but it's a cup of coffee.
Coffee it is.
Coffee it is. A complicated system would be manufacturing a Boeing 787 airplane. Once it's designed, the rule book's now really big, but you put parts at the beginning and at the end comes out a Boeing 787. A complex system would be raising a child, and you've raised two. And you know that on day one of the child, what you tell the child to do and what you aspire for the child to do at age 21 is not what's going to happen. Every little thing you do, the child evolves and changes and grows and develops, and all that stimuli is positive and negative along the way. And at the end, the child is whatever the child is, but it evolves in a way that you can't predict. That's what a startup community is. You cannot predict what that outcome is, and you can't control the outcome. The last, and we cover this in the book, and there's several examples. I gave one, which was the notion of capital not just being money, and defining it as the 7 capitals instead of just financial capital. Another would be something we call the measurement trap. Everyone in the startup community feels the need to measure things, and this is especially true for government. This is especially true for nonprofits, like the different associations that you probably described. They're measuring constantly number of companies created, number of unicorns, dollars raised, number of jobs. These are things to measure, but they're not the important things. They're the easy things. And the really important thing that happens in the growth and development of a startup community and complex system is not the parts, not creating more pieces. It's the interaction between the pieces, interaction between the parts. And measuring that interaction is really, really difficult. But that's where all the power comes from.
Got it. Love it. Hey, Brad, first of all, thank you so much. I know you're crazy busy with promoings on the book and everything. So thanks for taking time to come join us here on TechStrong TV. Best of luck with the book. We should mention it's available on Amazon. It's on all the usual places where one buys books today. Not going to bookstores very much, unfortunately. But yes, so it's the Startup Community Way. Ian Hathaway, Brad Feld. Check it out. It's available in Kindle and hardcover at this point. I don't think a paperback is out yet, right?
No paperback yet, just Kindle.
Yep, hardbook and Kindle. I have it on my Kindle here. I was already with my notes. But Brad Feld, author, Startup Community Way, Foundry Group, Techstars, tech entrepreneur extraordinaire, and one of my best friends for a long time.
Thanks for doing this. It's so awesome to see you. And congrats on everything you're doing with your business now. It's wonderful to see it.
Thank you. When we first launched TechStrong TV, right in the midst of everyone running home work from home in COVID. My thought was I always wanted it to be more of a network, and then we would have individual reoccurring segments. And our next segment here is kind of my first foray into this. It's called DevOps Unbound. It is scheduled to be a bi-weekly 40-minute show where we'll have 3 to 6 people diving deep on an area around DevOps, acceleration, automation, different areas of DevOps, but how it all comes together to make business better today, because ultimately that's why we do this, right? And so this is our first episode of DevOps Unbound. It features Dr. Grigory Melnik, who's actually Chief Product Officer at Tricentis, who's kind enough to sponsor the show. But Grigory's been on before. He's just so passionate about testing. I couldn't think of a better person to have on this initial show. And it also features James Bach, who literally wrote the book on different areas of testing, and he was one of Apple's first test engineers back in the 1980s. So 2 amazing testing experts who come from very different worlds. We have a PhD and a high school dropout, but they both are at the pinnacle of the testing world. Here now is DevOps Unbound, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the very first episode of DevOps Unbound. I'm your host, Alan Schimmel, and joining us for this initial episode of DevOps Unbound, I'm proud and happy to introduce you to James Bach and Grigory Melnik. Grigory, James, welcome to DevOps Unbound.
Hey everyone.
Before we jump into things, let me give each of you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourselves, your backgrounds, your positions, etc., so that our audience kind of knows a little bit, if they don't already, who you both are. So, Grigory, you've already been a guest on our show, so if you don't mind, I'm going to ask James to go first. James, introduce yourself. Go ahead.
My name is James Bach. I'm a consulting software tester. I started as a developer in my teen years after I dropped out of high school. I'm the proudest high school dropout you will ever meet. I later wrote a book about dropping out of high school and my particular self-education method. But my big opportunity came when Apple Computer hired me to be a test manager. And at the time, I was the youngest manager in the R&D division of Apple Computer. So that's kind of something I'm proud of. And I fell in love with testing, and I decided to devote my career to testing. I studied the epistemology of testing, the mathematics of testing, the sociology of testing. I am a bit obsessed with testing. And
to say the least.
I wrote a book about that called Lessons Learned in Software Testing with a couple of co-authors. And now I teach and consult.
Excellent. And you know what, high school dropout or not, you've done pretty darn good. So congratulations. And not saying it's an example for our younger people in the audience to necessarily emulate. Of course, James grew up in...
My son did better than me. He never went to high school, so I'm
really
he's already outdone me.
Absolutely. Very good. Grigory, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Grigory Melnik, and I'm the Chief Product Officer of Tricentis, focusing on building the testing tooling of the future, testing tools for the future. Previously, I guess I spent almost 2.5 decades focusing on the developer audience and building all kinds of platforms at Microsoft and Splunk and MongoDB, and always being kind of customer obsessed in a sense of developer obsessed quite a bit, making sure that whatever we were focusing on would help drive the productivity and alleviate some of the pains that developers in our target audience had. Well, a few of those things that I'm particularly proud of, my team at Microsoft was actually the first one that built the very first auto-scaling for what was back known as Windows Azure, now Microsoft Azure, but also focused on common patterns and practices and implementing the cross-cutting components that represent cross-cutting concerns that later would make into the .NET framework. So again, a lot of work identifying those patterns, capturing them, externalizing them, testing them out, and then helping drive the reuse. When it comes to testing, I first kind of discovered it in my days in academia when I was doing research and teaching at universities. And it was quite interesting because testing was predominantly viewed through the lens of formal method proofs. It wasn't really viewed as an activity, as an intellectual activity of discovery, as an intellectual activity of exploring or experiencing something. And those were actually the days when I've encountered the group of testers from the context-driven school of testing, including James, and we kind of kept in touch ever since. Even with me gravitating away from the testing more into the developer world, and now doing like the full loop of coming back to testing. And I have to tell you, I felt, when the opportunity came, I felt that the world of testing, at least from the perspective of how the discipline itself has advanced, would be way further developed in the last decade than I found it, after kind of leaving it for a while. So I'm now on the mission of kind of reigniting that whole discipline and putting it more on the pedestal and giving it more view and empowerment and leveling up all around. So yeah.
Excellent. So thank you both, gentlemen. And I'm Alan Schimmel. I'm the editor-in-chief, CEO for MediaOps, the folks behind DevOps.com, Container Journal, Security Boulevard, TechStrong TV, etc. And just quickly before we jump into today's agenda, DevOps Unbound, though today's focus is on testing, is not just about testing. It's really about DevOps kind of unbound, setting us free, right? Being able to leap tall buildings and, bound into space, or freeing ourselves of gravity, or whatever you want. It's about speed. It's about acceleration, right? It's about automation in a lot of ways. And we're going to be doing these every other week, and each episode will focus on particular aspects of this unbound nature, if you will. Today's is testing. And then once a month, we're also going to have a roundtable with about 6 or 8 people of Grigori and James's stature, and we'll open it up to the public for live audience questions and discussion. So I'm really looking forward to that. DevOps Unbound is sponsored by our friends at Tricentis, and we thank them for it. And with that out of the way, let's jump into things. So Grigori, I wanted to start off, obviously you and James take very different paths to and both of you have been very successful in your lives and careers. So it just goes to show there's more than one way to skin the cat, right? But let's take a look. Look, I'm probably older than both of you, though not that much, I'm sure. But let's look at the historical context of where you guys come from to be sitting here today, and how that, vis-a-vis is kind of the whole testing industry, the whole testing, you want to call it a profession, the guild, the whatever you want to call it, right? How has this evolved over the years? And let's put some context in with timeframes. James, when you first went to Apple, without saying you're old, what kind of, what were the timeframes for that?
Well, I am old.
So am I.
But you're older, which is nice. It's nice to be a young guy in the room again.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I can't tell you how well that makes me feel, but go ahead.
1st, 1987. May 21st, 1987 was the first day that I ever professionally tested something as a tester. Before that, I was doing video game development, and I had done informal testing, and I hated testing because testing just got in the way of me shipping my product. So I didn't like testing until it became my job. And then I realized I'm perfect for testing because I love complaining. And I'm much more interested in finding how things don't work than to figure out how to make them work.
That's interesting. You know, my background's in cyber, or back then we called it InfoSec. And in InfoSec, most of the people who got into InfoSec got into it because they like to break things, right? Yeah, same thing. Grigory, how does that, time frame wise and everything else, how does that match up with your own experience?
So I like to actually build things. I'm like you guys who are breaking things, and occasionally I break things. And actually, this also speaks about this overall, I guess, optimism of most developers who think that what they write is perfect, and always underestimate the amount of buggy code that we put in there. So. But to me, if I think about my first day when I actually had my job as an engineer, actually, it was September, I think, 5th, 1990, so a few years after James. And at that time, I was actually writing a C library for a PC, converting the data from mainframe into the visual format. And I had to deal with all kinds of quirks of Fortran and the 80 characters limit and the asterisks for bringing to the continuation of the line, all kinds of exciting stuff. But back to to make sure that I don't go too far on the tangent, we actually didn't have for a very, very long time. Again, I'm giving you my angle into the testing, if you will. We actually didn't have a dedicated, thinking about testing as an activity, as a pursuit of excellence. It was just something that you kind of were doing, and then at some point later, you've heard and learned that, oh wait, look, there is a QA department apparently, right? And they're the ones that were mostly viewed as gatekeepers or police of some sort. Right, and then again, if I think about, again, once I got more into the research and academia and studying testing specifically, because I'm probably one of the very few people who has testing in the title of my PhD dissertation. But I remember looking back and thinking, well, where did it come from, right? Where did actually software engineering come from, right? And of course, this is where the history of the conference back, after the war in Garmisch, where all the stalwarts of at that time computer science and not even computer science, mathematics departments, because that's who were doing all the programming back then, had coined the software engineering discipline. And later on, this association of debugging, right, with the infamous story of how the moth was found in Harvard University scientific lab, and the term debugging was coined. I almost think like in the early days, it was very much associated with this era of debugging, right? Then later on, the era of this ability to demo, the fact that the software was matching the spec or the requirements. There was, I think, it almost feels like there were at least a decade when people were fixated, and some would argue that it's still continuous.
What decade was that? What decade are you referring to?
The debugging, or the debugging, I'd say.
Are you talking about the 70s? Are you talking about the 60s? Are you talking about the 50s?
I'm talking about 50s and 60s. I'm talking about the 50s and 60s as almost the era of debugging, the way I viewed it. Then after that, the era of more like 70s and 80s, where you were focusing more on matching the spec and demoing that the software would actually, or proving. And this is where this big focus was on formal methods and trying to even mathematically prove that software worked according to the spec. And then after that, I feel like the next era was the era of breaking, or something that probably still continuing as well. And again, all these elements I feel are present in today's profession of testing. But the later years, the last 20 years, was everything that I was kind of studying, watching from the sidelines, getting myself into. I like to call it the era of enlightenment, if I may. I know that's super pompous of me, but this is where I view more testing in the way how James and other members of the context-driven school of testing had formulated it, which is, lighting the way for the decision maker, not for the developer necessarily, not for, again, it could be for the developer, but somebody who at the end of the day makes the decision whether what is being produced is acceptable enough, or if it's good enough to ship. Is it what risks associated there, and informing me as a decision maker about all these different factors, and then leaving that decision up to me. So the testers are not the police. They're not the quality gate. They're not assuring anything. It's really up to the stakeholder who is commissioning all this effort and who makes the ultimate decision about releasing something, putting something into production.
Well, I'd like to offer some historical notes on this. Okay, first, are you aware what the first book was on the subject of software testing? First known book? Little quiz for you, Grigory.
Is it the Myers book?
It's before that. It's Program Test Methods from 1972 by Bill Hetzel. Now, that book was a report on a conference, a testing conference, which was the Chapel Hill conference, which happened in 72. That seems to have been a historical watershed event in testing. Before that, the first chapter on software testing that I've been able to find was written in 1961 by my teacher, Jerry Weinberg, who wrote it when he was 25 years old. It's a brilliant chapter on testing. What's fascinating to me is how differently Weinberg talks about testing in 1961 compared to how they talked about testing in 1972, although there is a reference in the 1972 book back to Weinberg praising Weinberg's attitude about testing. It's fascinating to read that, because the book in 1961, it's Computer Programming Fundamentals, and the chapter about testing was written by Jerry, he told me, although it's co-written. The book's co-written with Herbert Leeds and Jerry Weinberg, but Jerry wrote the chapter on testing. And Jerry talks about testing as a matter of imagination, not automation, as a matter of being suspicious and critical, as a fundamentally unalgorithmic process. And he develops this beautiful story in his chapter about a programmer who's sure that he's found the last bug, and then finds out that he's wrong. And then he adds another check for that, and then he's sure now he's found the last bug, and then he sees something else go wrong. And Jerry's conclusion is, look, this is just, we're working on complex systems, and this is always going to be like this. Now, Jerry was on the first project in 1958 that ever had a dedicated test team. Now, the reason why he knows that is that in 1961, IBM held a conference of all the computer programmers in the entire world, of which there were 400 apparently. And Jerry said his team went to that conference. He was at IBM at the time. And he said everyone thought they were crazy because they had a dedicated group of testers and no one else did. They all were just testing their own stuff. So it seemed like the idea of having a dedicated test team caught on. And then in 1972, the way they talked about testing was all about test cases, automation, formality, and that kicked off the era, I think, of the factory, the test factory. We can have technology and we can have procedures that make it so you don't rely on human thinking. So this goes against what Jerry Weinberg was preaching, not only back in 61, but all through his career. I became a student of Jerry's in around 1989 and took all his classes in mid-90s, and he became a mentor to me. That's why I'm a real acolyte of Jerry Weinberg, because he always put the human in the center of everything. But testing, when I joined testing, all the testing textbooks were about how you have to define test cases and, if possible, automate them. And I felt like that was a fool's idea. I think, well, the problem is that there's too many things to define, and far from being unbound, we become super bound by all of these documents and all of this code. And so if you want to be unbound, we have to find a way to temper that. We have to find a way to interact with our tools so that we're not constrained too much by them. And that, in the 90s, the urge to unbind ourselves from that waterfall world and that heavy documentation world created Agile, but it also created the context-driven school of software testing, which is a humanist approach to software testing. And that was in the mid-90s that we started creating that. And then DevOps and Agile continued to sort of take over the world, except that it seems to me that Agile in a lot of places has lost its humanist foundation, and it's turned into tools. And so if we're going to really talk about unbound, DevOps unbound, it seems to me that we have to be specific about what is it we're unbinding. I hope what this means is it's people being unbound, using DevOps as a tool rather than...
But not just the tool. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump in. But not just... You know what, James? We don't want to make the same mistake that Agile made. And you just said one of the problems with the Agile is we went from humanist to tools, right? Too much of a reliance on tools. Let's not make the same mistake in DevOps. And I think that's something I've advocated for a while, too, is we can't lose the human in DevOps.
Actually, I want to hear you say more about that, Alan, if you're willing to say a little more about that.
I'm not shy. I'll give you my 2 cents. I started DevOps.com. I cover this place. I cover this area pretty heavily, and I have for 7 or 8 years now. And I think there's been this, and I don't want to say Agile failed, because Agile is far from a failure. But there has been a reliance on tools and maybe overly processed. You know, when we think about things like IDLE and ITSM versus DevOps, let's say, right? We tend to point fingers at IDLE, and ITSM, and said, too much process, too heavy, too many, too much of that whole change management thing. But there are good things there. Nothing's all bad and all good. The world's not black and white. It's gray, right? And so there are things we take out of IDLE and things and ITSM that we put into DevOps. But DevOps, to me anyway, and it's just my humble opinion, is fundamentally about people and teams and culture, not the tools. There's a lot of tools we could use, and there's overlap in tools, and what's the best tool for any given job? We could fight about it till the cows come home. But at its nitty-gritty, DevOps is making sure that devs and ops and test and security and these people work with a higher degree of communication, right? With a higher degree of cooperation, getting jobs done faster. And we do that by adding things like automation to the mix. But automation for automation's sake alone is not enough, right? And to do automation, yes, you got to use tools sometimes to make that automation work. I get it. But if we lose the fundamental aspect that DevOps is at its core about humans, I think we lose what DevOps is. And I don't hold myself out to be as accomplished as either one of you. But I do
still
firmly
love
believe
you,
that.
Alan. I love what you just said. I think this is, if you can hold on to what the principle and the feeling behind what you just said, we can do anything with tools and we'll be okay. We'll be okay if we're talking to each other, if we're caring about each other. I keep seeing people losing that. And of course, any technology and any methodology, when it is applied sociopathically, will become abuse.
Yeah.
And so we just, those of us who can, should do whatever we can to keep it non-abusive and keep us talking. And then I think DevOps can be a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to take us down that. Go ahead, Grigory.
No, it's super encouraging to hear what you said, Alan. And again, I'm a very big believer into the greatness of human mind. But it feels to me that in this kind of history of our industry, the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth, right? Remember the whole infatuation with the case tools, back in the back in the 80s and 90s, and then later on there was this whole big movement of the software factories. Like the term was actually software factories, where the idea was that you can go and abstract away at some high level, and then the tools will generate all the code and everything for you and make it all highly maintainable, all of that. And of course that failed too. But I think it's out of this desire for some reason to come up with these boosters. So I don't know, some kind of the way of equipping the humans to deal with the inherently complex problems, where today there's no better mechanism of dealing with them other than human brain is. So this whole vision of computers writing computer code, I mean, that's been promised in the first era of AI. Not today, but I'm talking about the 60s, right? In the 70s, where all
Spielberg
people,
does
and then it
pictures.
kind of died out, right? Same thing again. Doing having the computers entirely come up with the test strategy, thinking about testing automatically, entirely automatically. I think it's utopical, at least if you think about what the tools are capable of doing today, and for a very, very long time in the future, I think the human will remain to be at the center of this activity. While again, all the tooling is great, because tooling gives you additional powers and additional ways of perhaps automating the most rudimentary, the most boring elements of the job, and lets you actually free up time to think about new theories, new hypotheses, new models, new approaches.
But you got to consider different kinds of tools. Like, have you noticed the difference between, let's say, a tool like a programmer's IDE? When I use a programmer's IDE, I don't feel oppressed. I feel empowered. I feel like I'm riding a magic carpet and I have laser cannons mounted on it. I feel wonderful. But when I use most testing tools, I feel oppressed. Like I have just a few possible things I can do, and if I have any...
Like you're castrated.
That's outside of what the test tool designer has thought that I might want to do for testing, then I'm not allowed to do that. This is what I feel like when I encounter something like Cucumber, which is very restricted. In the Gherkin language, it's very restricted. It's stopping me from going on flights of imagination. And yet when I use the tools that programmers have created for programmers, unsurprisingly, programmers have created for programmers tools that make them feel powerful and free and able to do all kinds of wonderful things. I would like to bring the same sense of freedom to testing that programmers already enjoy. That's part of what we're doing with the transformation work we're doing at Tricentis.
Yeah, well,
I love that.
In all fairness, not all of the programmers' tools are that liberating. Some of them feel like you are operating in the straitjacket too. But in general, at least there are some examples. There are instances of tooling that are widely accepted, widely adopted today that are supporting and kind of accelerating your abilities to do your job without constraining you. That's for sure. And the piece that James was alluding to, this is actually the new initiative that we are driving inside Tricentis, about imagining this whole new platform of the test tools for the future, where we are building something akin to the IDE. We're actually not calling it IDE, we're calling it ITE, Integrated Testing Environment, where actually it's the human being, the human tester, who is in the very, very center of the IT, and all these other snippets and utilities and services and everything around the human tester, around the human there, meant to support the individual in the way wherever his line of thought, line of exploration, line of test execution may lead to. Okay, so again, we're kind of envisioning this to be as a super configurable kind of morphing tool, almost like, the chameleon style, where depending on the context and the environment, the different capabilities of the IT, the integrated testing environment, will present themselves, and then the human will actually pick whether this is actually something that they want to take advantage or not, as opposed to, again, being forced into a specific kind of mold or one way of doing testing. And we don't think actually anybody has attempted something of this caliber, specifically in the space of test tooling before. That's why we're so enthusiastic and so passionate about this project, aren't we, James?
I also don't think that anyone is going to be able to copy us easily, because the only way that they could actually compete with us is by hiring someone who loves testing, which test tool companies hate doing, because testers are troublemakers. I still can't really, it's hard for me to fathom that Grigory really knows what he's done by hiring me, because I'm a constant gadfly. I'm constantly complaining about the state of test tools in the world and at Tricentis, frankly, and I want things to be fundamentally better. But that means we have to fundamentally change how we think about what is a tester, which might get us into the role of testing a bit. But to me, a tester is a puzzle solver, a problem finder. I'm not a button pusher, and I'm not a verifier. I don't verify things. Tools can verify things. I'm not looking to prove that something works, because I can't prove that anything works. What I can do is collect evidence and then draw inferences from that evidence with a critical mindset. And of course, lots of tools are collecting facts about the products that I'm testing, and that can be automated. And so we're pulling in these facts, and we can say we got this output, and we expected to get this output. So apparently, there's no problem here as far as we can tell so far. But then the tester layers onto that a critical mindset, saying, "But how do we know? And how could we be fooling ourselves?" And so I'm bringing that mentality into Tricentis, and I'm really surprised so far. They've been actually quite welcoming of me. But for years and years, I've tried to help other tool companies with this, and basically, you know what reaction I get? They basically say, "Well, our customers just want to have automation that just pushes a bunch of buttons, and we don't really care about test design. We don't really care about empowering testers. So that's not going to help us make any money, James. So we're really not interested in supporting the skilled testers that you keep talking about." So Tricentis has a different kind of vision that I think is hard to match.
There's also a little bit of you can't make wine before it's time, right? And I think, right, I think you need the right macro conditions that things like DevOps have brought about, and the whole progression. I mean, we've gone back here now to the 50s and 60s and all the way to the present time. Certainly, the world we live in today, maybe I want to think so anyway. We're a little bit more open to the idea of saying, look, yeah, we can automate some stuff. We don't need a human to just push buttons, right? We have tools that can go push the buttons for us, but we need humans to do blank. We need humans to do some of this stuff. And so we need to enable and empower them to do that within the context of let's automate what should be automated, let's say. But we still need those humans in there. You know, when I was growing up, much like you guys, right? The only animal in the world that used tools was humans. Isn't that's what I learned in school, right? That's what separated us from animals. One of the things, right, was our ability to use tools. Well, then we found out chimpanzees use tools and other monkeys use tools. And we still were okay with that because they were primates. Now we found birds use tools, right, to crack nuts and stuff like this. So tool use in itself does not connotate one's intelligence or higher being. We need to. So to me, that's the ultimate case, right? It's not about what tools we use. It's about how we use our brains. And I think that's apropos to what we see in testing today. Yes, we could come up with tools, but it's creating an environment for people to think in and use their brains in and apply it that I think will ultimately provide us the highest payback, if you will. Right? And
it's interesting what you just said about you're implying that the history of how we got to where we are now is important, that we have to have a certain historical context, technological context, in order to take the next leap. And I think one thing in which that's really true is we have decades as an industry, decades and decades of experience trying to eliminate people from engineering. And we can't do it. I remember, maybe you do, there were these advertisements in Byte magazine in the 80s about case tools. And now your marketing people can just define your product and you don't need developers anymore because it automatically generates all the code. And I remember sitting there at Apple Computer reviewing case tools advertisements that had been sent to me thinking, well, could I buy some of these tools and actually use them to help with the testing? And it turned out, no, you couldn't. It was just all hype and nothing. So I shrugged. And so even today, now we have AI. AI is the new case tool. And the AI will do all this stuff for you. Then it turns out the AI is biased and racist and confused. And if you put kitten ears on a whale, it says that's a kitten.
Yep. And it's no more than ML, the machine learning anyway. But yes, we have been chasing this white whale for most of my adult life. And at the same time, if it was a nation, the fastest growing nation on earth are developers. There's 40-something million is the estimate, growing 20% a year or something like that. So, I think it's time we stop probably chasing that white whale and move on to empowering people.
One way to do that, I suggest a definition of programmer or perhaps developer. And the definition I use is a developer is someone who stands at the gateway between the world of the machines and the world of humans. And the developer's purpose is to operate competently in the world of people and then operate competently in the world of machines. And if you don't have that person standing at the gateway, then you don't have a connection between the world of humans and the world of machines. You just have people kind of praying to the god of technology and hoping that good things happen. And so no matter how complicated technology gets, no matter how much AI we have, we still have the need to operate competently in the world of people, and the developers will always live right at that threshold. And testers need to live there too, and not get mowed under by automation.
And you know what, guys, we're almost out of time, but this also brings up something that I thought we might be able to get to on this show, but we're running out of time, and that is that this caste system, if you will, case system of developers being a higher caste than the tester, who's higher than what we call today the SRE, the ops person or what have you, and this whole IT stack of humanity. I think we need to examine that too. When when we're asking the developer to do the security and the testing, is he any better than the tester? Is there a difference? But we're going to save that one, I think, for another show. If you guys would like to come back on, and we can explore that a bit.
I'm back, but I categorically reject that whole hierarchy, and I also do not like the whole, notion when people say, "Hey, but the tools and everything, they would really help with the low-skilled tester." That's another notion that kind of gets the hair on my neck.
Reject that.
It's just so annoying, and whether it's development or testing or any other, data science, modeling, the UX design, it's the discipline. It's something that requires dedicated effort of studying, perfecting, thinking about, the way how people do that work, and it requires intellect. that's the most important. And using some very powerful tools don't give you the license to turn off your brain. And again, happy to come back on the show and talk about the different career ladders and progressions, because again, it's gonna take us longer to discuss.
That's a whole nother show. I can tell.
There's a lot to
and vocal about that.
Say about
James?
that. But I just want to note that this whole issue has been studied in great depth in another field, in the field of the sociology of science. For instance, in physics, theorists are in the higher caste and experimentalists are in the lower caste. So if you're an engineer, you're in the lower caste. And they've studied this. How do these people cooperate? How do they assign prestige to each other? It's a well-known phenomenon in many fields of human endeavor.
And the same thing in math, right? The theoretical math versus applied math. The theoretical math seems to always think that they're the gods, and they're the ones that are, creating something that will take centuries for the world to truly appreciate. And then you guys are in the applied math are solving the problems of today.
Exactly. Guys, we're out of time, but I'm going to hold this. I'm going to hold you both to it. We're going to come back on, not in the next show, because I think we have something scheduled, but in one of the ones coming up, we'll have you both back on. Or maybe this will serve as part of our first roundtable in about a month from now, when we'll open it up to the audience as well. But for now, Grigory, James, thank you. Yes.
Thanks,
James,
Alan.
Thank you. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure. This is Alan Schimmel. You just watched the very first DevOps Unbound. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a fresh panel, fresh topics. Stay tuned. Thanks again to Tricentis for sponsoring, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye. For our something old, I went back to the TechStrong Con archives and pulled up my friend Derek Weeks of Sonatype, and one of the co-founders of All Day DevOps, who coincidentally, I think, just launched their new website, and registration for All Day DevOps this year is now open. Derek presented at TechStrong with Machines Making Software, Paving and Maintaining the Road with Zero Trust Open Source. And, Derek's been surveying and researching open source security for a number of years now, 5, 6, maybe more years. And that body of knowledge is now expansive, and he has collaborators. It all comes together in this presentation that Derek made at TechStrong Con. I hope you'll enjoy it.
Hey everyone, I'm Derek Weeks. I am Vice President at Sonatype and also the co-founder of All Day DevOps. I'm super excited to talk to you today about some research I've been doing over the last number of years, 6 or 7 years now, around open source supply chains, DevSecOps, and some of the data-driven look we have at these topics. So with that, why don't we kick this off and sit back for a great story. So an organization's journey to excellence begins once it ceases to sacrifice quality for speed. But, you know, we're at a DevOps conference. It's all about speed, right? I mean, we've listened to Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble and Gene Kim and read the State of DevOps reports and all the DORA reports, and we know that the best organizations out there, the peak performers, are deploying 46 times faster than others. They're more profitable. They have higher market share. They have 7 times lower change failure rates in their organizations. And they have 2,600 times faster time to recover within those organizations. They're also 1.7 times more likely to extensively use open source within their environments. And in fact, you know, each year I go out and run the DevSecOps community survey. We're in our 7th year of running that survey now. And one of the things that we see year after year, and you perhaps see this in your own organization, there are many organizations that are deploying faster and faster. 47% of the folks in our survey last year were deploying multiple times a week within their environments. But the important thing about this is it's an internal benchmark of speed. And I'm going to get back to that because it's going to be an important part of the conversation here. So we obviously know from the State of DevOps report and DORA and everyone else that faster is better in the enterprise. But as I said, if you look at fast as an internal benchmark, you may be missing the key point. When in 2017, Jeff Bezos issued a letter to his shareholders in their annual report. And as part of that letter, he said, beware of the proxies. Beware of the proxies really, you know, to him in that circumstance was if you focus so much on processes and we're getting faster, we're, you know, at Amazon, we're able to ship products faster, get more products in inventory, perhaps spin up AWS cloud environments faster than anyone else. You may miss something out there that's the bigger context of what makes the business hum. So that beware of the proxies is really important when we think about DevSecOps, because part of it is you could get faster at automating security practices within DevOps, but you have to understand your adversaries are doing the same thing. And we know from looking at adversaries that they are getting faster, and the better adversaries are the fastest ones. If we look back to 2018 in the Equifax breach, there was a vulnerability in an open source component, Struts, that Equifax was using. It was aware of this vulnerability and updated some of their Struts instances, but not all of them. And within 3 days, Equifax was breached by their adversary or the hackers. But on those same days, Canada Revenue, Canada Statistics, GMO Payment Gateway, and within a couple of days, Okinawa Power and Japanese Post were also breached through the same vulnerability. The adversaries were moving on Equifax as well as others within a 3-day period. In our DevSecOps community survey this year, we've asked people, have you had or experienced an open source related breach in the past 12 months? And the overall responses within those organizations showed us 21%, or 1 in 5 organizations had an open source related breach in the past 12 months. But interestingly, the most mature organizations represented in this survey, those that had multiple attributes of mature DevOps practices, including that they were using a software bill of materials, 28% of those experienced a breach. And that's probably because they were more aware of the breach than those in less mature DevOps practices. So the key thing when we think about these open source related breaches is this challenge that we have, that not only do we want to automate ourselves and automate our practices and collaborate with security more and push security earlier in the development lifecycle to improve our own practices from an internal benchmark, but we need to look at this external benchmark of how fast are the adversaries. Between 2006 and 2017, when the time between a vulnerability being announced and the exploits appearing in the wild decreased from 45 days to 3 days, your adversaries are getting much, much faster. And when it comes to open source related issues, there are a number of that have come up in the news overall that we've been tracking as part of the research that I've been doing. And I'll go back to July 2017. Stealing credentials. When we look at a story that broke in the news, 79,000 packages within the NPM repository had their credentials stolen. This means that hackers or adversaries could break into those open source components or open source projects, inject malicious code, make changes or create backdoors in those codes because they had the credentials to be able to log in and do that. We saw instances of malicious code injection in November 2018 with EventStream. That was a project that had an adversary come in, inject malicious code into it. That code was then downloaded from the NPM repositories 2 million times a week. The target of this particular attack happened to be Copay, which is a cryptocurrency wallet, where the adversary knew that they were using that open source project and wanted to take advantage of stealing money from the customers using those wallets. We also see other types of attacks on these open source components and software supply chains. Just last month, April 2020, we saw over 700 Ruby Gems packages that were typo squatted on the Ruby Gems repository. Typo squatting means that we're taking a particular component and we're creating a new version of it, but just with a slightly different name. So instead of the Billy Bob component with 1 B, maybe it has 2 B's listed in it. A project called Color may be COLOR, or the typo squatted version may be COLOUR. So common misspellings or typos related to packages is also on the rise, where these malicious packages are being inserted into these repositories that are downloaded through software supply chains. And again, this is going to tie to a lot of the research that I'm going to share with you as we go through this presentation. So just this month, May 2020, we have seen another instance of open source related breaches come through SaltStack. So SaltStack is a common open source component. It is sometimes deployed into production or internet facing environments. There was a vulnerability known in this particular component. SaltStack is a project and a company created newer, safer versions of those components. When the vulnerabilities were disclosed to them, they made proper disclosure announcements to all of their customers. But those that didn't update after the vulnerabilities had been publicly announced, that didn't update to the safer versions, within 3 to 5 days, there were 5 breaches known to be attributed to organizations that didn't know that they were using vulnerable versions of SaltStack, the versions that had become vulnerable and didn't upgrade or update those components before adversaries could take advantage of their infrastructure. The guys at F-Secure that found this particular vulnerability, when asked about it, said this is a situation where it's really patched by Friday or be compromised by Monday. This is it plays into, not only are all of us using a bunch of open source components that we're sourcing through our software supply chains, but we need to be aware of when there are changes in these, how fast our adversaries are in attacking us against those vulnerabilities or trying to exploit those. Through the work that I've done in the software supply chain report over the last 6 years, we've tracked over 25 different instances of typo squatting, credentials being stolen, malicious code injection, et cetera, that are tied to these. Now, this is actually this kind of background on studying software supply chains and cybersecurity and DevSecOps is what led to an intersection of myself and others at Sonatype, where I work, with Gene Kim and Dr. Stephen McGill in 2018, where we saw these patterns emerging in the market or emerging in the ecosystem in the open source community of vulnerable components, vulnerabilities being exploited, DevOps teams moving faster and wanting to operate at higher velocity because there were better business outcomes associated with that. So we've partnered for the last 2 years on creating and releasing the research on an annual basis in the State of the Software Supply Chain report. This is a report I've actually championed for the last 6 years, but as I said, in the past 2 years, partnering with Gene Kim and Stephen McGill to bring even more academic rigor to the supply chain report itself, and to really shed light on these and other problems with the open source ecosystem that are directly tied to DevOps practices out in the market. So I've mentioned software supply chains a couple of times. And I want to, before I get too far into this, I'll take a step back for those that aren't familiar with software supply chains. All of you in your organizations that are developing software have a software supply chain. In this particular case, we look at it from a standpoint of open source projects. There are open source projects out there developing code that's made freely available to you and your organizations. Those projects as suppliers put their code into warehouses like Maven Central, npm.js, rubygems.org, the PyPy repository, et cetera, and it's downloaded by you and your software development teams as the manufacturers using those component parts to produce finished goods. If you think about containers, they also represent a software supply chain or your use of a software supply chain. I create a container as a supplier. I put it into Docker Hub as a warehouse. Your operations team downloads that container and puts it into your production environment. That's also a software supply chain. All of you are using them, and you're using them at volumes and demand levels that are astronomical. Let's look at some of that just to better quantify it. Now, at Sonatype, we happen to run the Maven Central repository for all the Java open source components out there. We track the number of download requests year over year within this repository. And just last year, in 2019, we saw 226 billion download requests from the Maven Central repository. Now, to put it in context, there are only about 10 million Java developers in the world that would be requesting or downloading these components from the Maven Central repository. But it's not just Maven Central. If you look at the stats on npm.js or the npm repository, just recently acquired by GitHub, they publish stats all the time. In last month, in April, they had 84 billion package downloads. If you annualize this, that is double the number of monthly downloads they had a year ago. If you annualize this, there are 1 trillion NPM packages downloaded every year at this volume. There is a massive consumption of free open source packages, because why would you ever want to code from scratch what you could download from the internet in a second? Now, what this really means is that of the code that you're developing, it is often 85 to 95% of an application you are building today is created from these open source components. And within your organization, if you were just developing on Java alone, I looked at 15,000 different organizations and analyzed for the software supply chain report and analyzed their consumption patterns. In these organizations, the average organization was downloading over 300,000 packages from 2,700 different open source suppliers. Of those suppliers, they were consuming 8,200 different versions of parts or open source components from those suppliers. They're just downloading those parts a massive number of times. If we look at the JavaScript development practices, there are about 10.5 million JavaScript developers around the world now. Based on 1 trillion downloads a year that they are targeting at current download volumes, that would mean every single JavaScript developer you have on staff is downloading over 93,000 JavaScript packages every year, right? Now, the good news is this is making us all faster. We don't have to code from scratch anymore. We can download from the internet in seconds these components. It's playing, the use of open source is playing into some of the DevOps outcomes that we have of deploying value faster to our customers by taking advantage of this open source. But not all of these open source components are created equally. As you've seen in this slide, and the last slide, not all these components are created equally. 51% of the NPM packages audited by NPM themselves had known security vulnerabilities. In the previous slide, about 10% of those Java components that were downloaded had known vulnerabilities. So we know that faster is better in the enterprise, but when we're reliant on so many different open source projects for the code that we are building with and deploying and delivering to our customers, we want to know, and we wanted to know in last year's research report, is faster better in open source? And how do we pick the very best suppliers? If we're going to work with 2,800 different Java external suppliers for our code, how do we pick the best ones? Well, they're really, when we think about measuring, you know, faster is better in the enterprise, is it faster better in open source? These are kind of two different worlds. You know, enterprise has multiple deploys a day, open source has versioned releases. Enterprises usually has consistent sized development teams that are well resourced. Open source projects are more fluid. Resources are more variable. But there are similar metrics that we could also use to compare these two different worlds. One is deployment frequency. It's similar to release frequency for these projects. Organizational performance ties in open source often to the popularity of projects. Mean time to restore in the enterprise could also be tied to things like time to remediate vulnerabilities that might appear within these open source components and projects. So when we started the research, we wanted to look at, you know, similarities in these groups and look at deployment frequency and popularity overall within these projects. So to do this, we needed a set of open source components to rely upon. And as I mentioned before, at Sonatype, we happen to run and operate the Maven Central repository, which has about 5 million open source component versions in it, or component releases in it. And we wanted to look across a broad set of these open source projects. We started with, we needed projects that had released multiple times over a 5-year period, followed a standard versioning practice, sometimes had known security vulnerabilities that had been updated, had more than one dependency on them, et cetera. And we came up with a group of 36,000 open source projects with a history of 5 years of deploying new versions of projects to the environment. And that was the set that we went against evaluating for this, this research. And we looked at a number of different attributes across these projects, from their popularity, the size of their development teams, their development speed, release frequency, were they using continuous integration platforms, what were their security update patterns, and so forth. As we looked at these practices and delved into the research, we had a couple of hypotheses that we went into, and I'm going to cover 4 here within this discussion. The first hypothesis is that projects that release frequently have better outcomes. This is kind of tied to the DORA or State of DevOps report showing enterprises that release frequently have better outcomes, which the DORA and State of DevOps reports have shown. Now, what we saw within these 36,000 open source projects was that we were able to validate this hypothesis. The projects that did release frequently had better outcomes. They were generally 5 times more popular. They attracted 79% more developers, and they were also more likely to be foundation supported within those environments. Now, we also wanted to look at, or we had another hypothesis of projects that update dependencies frequently were more secure. So if there was a known security vulnerability within a project, that's not good. We wanted to look at suppliers that had something not good happen where a vulnerability was found, and then they quickly updated, indicating a good track record and a good supplier that you could rely upon. Well, to do this, it wasn't necessarily straightforward research, so let me walk you through a little bit of how we approached it. First, we wanted to look at these 36,000 projects and take 3 key metrics into account. One is the time to remediate. So if there was a vulnerability, how long did it take them to fix that particular problem? In general, how long did they take to update? So how often were they releasing new versions of those projects, regardless of if there was a vulnerability or not? And then did they have any stale dependencies? So were they leaving dependencies behind or not updating to every new version of a dependency when it was coming out? To help you visualize this a little, there's just a quick picture that I'll share with you. Imagine an open source project, Project C, and that's on version 2.2. C has 2 vulnerabilities associated with it. Component A, 2.2, and B, 2.2. Those are the dependencies. Now, over time, we can see the behavior of C and its dependencies, A and B. In this particular scenario, B has a vulnerability discovered in it. When B has a vulnerability in it, we want to look at when did B update, let's say to version 2.3, and remediate that vulnerability. So when B does that, it fixes that vulnerability. But until C 2.3 adopts that version of B 2.3, C remains vulnerable. So in this case, you see when C 2.3 comes out, it's adopted B 2.3 and therefore eliminated that vulnerability. And in the time that that's happened, A has moved from 2.2 to 2.3 to 2.4, and C adopts version 2.4 of A. But 2.3 of A was skipped. That is a stale dependency. So we're measuring all of these patterns across these 36,000 open source projects to come up with what were the outcomes, or what did we see in terms of their speed to remediate any vulnerabilities in these environments. So what we saw is the mean time to remediate a vulnerability that appears in an open source project or one of its dependencies was almost a year. It was 326 days on average. The median time was 180 days, so just about 6 months. So this is somewhat startling if you're relying on projects, and these projects as suppliers to you have vulnerabilities found in them, and yet you might wait a year between the time the vulnerability is discovered and the time the project provides a new update of its component. In the case of SALT that I just mentioned a little while ago, or struts, those projects had known vulnerabilities and they updated them quickly. So the point between a vulnerability appearing and the new version available that fixed that was the same day. The same day the vulnerability was announced was the day that the safe package was released. But on average, that time is 326 days across this population of projects. So what we wanted to find out was, who were these projects that were updating the fastest? Like I mentioned, struts or salt stack were in this category of vulnerabilities appearing and remediation appearing also quickly. But we knew within these projects that not every open source project that we were looking at had a vulnerability that had been discovered with it. So we wanted to look at the overall update time within the projects and see how that compared to the time. So clearly, if you're